So on that note, Meg?
Good morning, everybody. I want to talk about the subjective experience of money, not the objective facts. I'll just mention that a bit. But really the subjective experience of money. And my whole gist this morning for all of you who have children and grandchildren to talk to, that the better you understand your relationship to money and the better you understand your feelings around it, the more able you're going to be to talk to them. It's not a simple matter to do it well. I'm going to start with two stories. One story is about a woman who loved to shop. She would get up every morning, and this is her aspiration for the day. She'd go to the stores, everybody made a big fuss over her, she loved the big fuss. She'd come back with packages into the apartment that she lived in. And this was fine for a bit, but after a while, her husband felt a little pushed out when he couldn't take a bath because there were packages in the bathtub. At this point, he got really upset, and this was a pretty mild-mannered guy, and asked her to stop, because they really couldn't keep doing this. Well, she was very chagrined and said, oh, okay. But guess what happened the next morning? Off she went to the stores. So that night, his patience was completely worn, and he blew up at her and said, you just can't do this anymore. She went to bed, and she didn't get up for 4 months. Another story of a very hard-working teacher who was very, very involved in teaching, loved the teaching, and she also lived in an apartment. And this apartment was a little smaller, but she noticed week after week, another card table would spring up and it would have stacks of mail on it, unopened. Now this is really weird because she had enough money, but she was so engaged in her teaching that she just didn't want to notice the pile-up on the card tables. So these are just two stories to give you an idea about how people can be pretty irrational about money. I want to mention a survey that was done before the Great Recession in 2008 by the American Psychological Association, and it was a national survey, and it stated that 80% of the people in this country name money as their #1 stress. And yet, there are very few therapists like myself who are really trained to help people with money in a specific way. Now, let me just run through a few facts, and bear with me, because I'll get to something more interesting, although I find these facts really interesting. Of 13 and 14-year-olds, 5% have credit cards. Of high school age kids, 33% have credit cards. Of college age kids, 84% have credit cards. And of that 84%, half of them have 4. The average debt on a college credit card is $2,200. The average debt on a graduate school credit card is $5,800. The average debt of an average American is $7,800, with a third of that being credit card debt. So this one is probably the most shocking to me, because my point that we may be a very affluent society, but I don't think we necessarily know how to manage our resources very well. Of 60-year-olds, half of them have $114,500 put away for retirement. The other half have $39,000. So just think about that, which makes my point that it's very, very important to learn about your relationship to money, because if you don't, the patterns that people have around money behavior will persist into adulthood. Now, what I'm going to start with, being a good psychologist, we always start with childhood. I want to talk about childhood and how some of these money beliefs get formed and how they transform through adolescence. into crystallized money types by the end of adolescence into college. And then I want to talk about a simple process for processing your own emotions and attitudes that will hopefully make it easier for you to talk to your kids. And I also want to include talking to each other, being couples and partners, because that's often very difficult too. So what happens in childhood? The objective facts of money are learned pretty easily. Around 4 or 5, the child begins to absorb math concepts, and parents use money to teach math. This is also done in the schools. That's the easy part. Although, as kids go on, they don't necessarily learn the math in terms of financial literacy, but that's another issue. The issue that I really want to focus on are the emotional messages that get sent to children by parents about money. And these emotional messages can often be unconscious, meaning we're not highly aware of what we're sending to our kids, even though we have all the best intentions in the world. And what I want to do for a minute, just to use as a bit of a little framework, do you all remember the story of the 3 little piggies? Okay. One little piggy built a house of straw. The straw house went up really quickly because he wanted to go out and play. So there we have that house. And that house I would name as carrying a sense of scarcity around money. All houses, all families have emotional climates and atmosphere. And this atmosphere is a sense of scarcity, a sense of fear, a sense of anxiety around money. And then the next little piggy builds a house of wood. Now this house is a pretty big house, lots of time on detail on the outside to make it really look good. It took them some amount of time to make it, but not so much because he was interested in going out and playing too. So this house has a sense of power about money, a sense that it is a very important thing because it can do so many very powerful things. And the third house is the brick house, the very patient pig, who spent a lot of time building the house, making sure it was strong. And in this house, there's a tremendous sense of abundance about money, where there's a sense of calm and security and safety. So when the storms of life and whatever is the big bad wolf in people's lives comes, guess whose house does the best? So what happens when you come from a house of scarcity, which is certainly the kind of house that I came from, even though there was a reasonable amount of money. I'm not talking about the absolute amount of money. That has nothing to do with it. It's how parents experience the money that they have. And in a straw house, in a house of scarcity, parents will have conflicts about money. They will argue about it. They may argue in front of the kids, even if they don't. The children are sponges for our affects. They pick up everything that we feel, and being immature beings that they are, they don't necessarily have a way to process those feelings. So they may get all kinds of misinformation from messages that we do not intend to send, but in fact we send them anyway. So to give you an example, somebody opens a credit card bill, and you may have a 6 or 7-year-old, and you open it, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's so big, oh I can't believe that he did that and he spent that, and she, and you go on and on like that to yourself, which is a pretty normal reaction. But your kid is watching you, and what are they thinking? Well, you don't know. Even if you ask them, they probably couldn't tell you. But what they're absorbing is that tension and that sense of, ooh. And if there's enough of that, then they can start forming beliefs about money. And kids being very self-absorbed, they'll think, oh, gee, did I do something wrong? Did I cause mom to get all upset about this? And they may take in, oh, my own needs, what I want are a burden, maybe I best not ask. And, you get a child that is too good, and you may, wish for this kind of child. But that's another story. There are some downsides to that too. Now, in a house of wood, there is a very different sense about money. There's a sense that this is powerful. This is a great resource. We've got lots of it, and we are going to, there's a sense of expansiveness and kind of limitlessness about it, so that there's nobody in the house that puts on the brakes about it. And kids tend to get anything they want pretty easily, so you all know where this one goes. And it can really lead to big problems, particularly if it's echoed in the major culture, in the culture at large. And then people who grow up with that sense of abundance, they have a much calmer sense about money. You know, they get good feelings about money, but not extravagant feelings about money. And that sense of emotional calm and ease just makes it so much easier for them to learn the objective facts of money, but also learn to treat it as a resource, but not the resource of all resources. So as kids grow, then they get exposed to school, and as they grow, you as parents and your messages get less and less important, even though they're still in the kid, but then they start making comparisons with their peer group, and I'm sure you all know about that. You know, Johnny comes home, oh, Sally got a cell phone, Sally got an iPad, I want one too, why can't I have one? And there it goes, we're off. And that's what I would call a teachable moment about money. You kind of got to slow it down and get in there and talk to the child, but we'll get to that at the end, how you can do that better. But the point is that the other kids become very important, and they challenge the values that you have tried to give your children in ways that can become very problematic, particularly in adolescence, because then children take a big step away from home, and the peer group becomes absolutely the most important group of people in their lives. And it's very, very interesting. There's a guy at Temple University who, Lawrence, I'll think of his name in a minute. What's his name? Anyway, he's a very good researcher on social emotional development in children and adolescents, particularly with high-risk behavior. And one of his studies found that in adolescence, the adolescents get uniquely sensitive to other adolescents' faces, just as a baby is very, very sensitive to a mother's face at birth, so that makes them highly interactive and highly sensitive to any messages that they get from other kids. And his research, Steinberg is his name, Lawrence Steinberg, and no, I'm over 60. And they get messages from other kids, and the kind of risk-taking that can start when kids get together and they feel their oaths, they feel their independence, and if they have money at their disposal, they can get into a lot of trouble. And that's another place where your messages from home that may be very, very distant now in their minds have to be reinforced in some effective way. And I will reiterate my main point in this. If you are clear about your money and how you think and feel about money, your interventions with your child, whether they're 7, 14, or 21, will go much more smoothly because you'll be sending one consistent message. Now, by the end of adolescence, as people get ready to go to college, money behavior tends to crystallize, and it crystallizes into patterns of use and a sense of, oh, this is me with money. And there's 6 basic money types, and I'm just going to run through the 6 types, and then we're going to talk about how to talk about money, and I hope you have a lot of questions. The 6 types. The first one is a spender. I've told you a vivid story about a spender. But this is somebody who loves the moment of impulse to buy something. Some people call it retail therapy. Very therapists have mixed feelings about retail therapy. But it's that sense of spontaneity and fun and just enjoying whatever you're doing and buying. And of course, there are ramifications at the end of the month about that, but that's not the point. The point is somebody is just enjoying the experience. Now, opposite the spender is the hoarder, somebody who is really afraid of spending money. They want to hold on to it, they want to put it under their mattress, they're terrified of somehow losing it, being taken advantage of, and they hold it closely, much to their detriment, because, you know, especially in investing, if you don't invest it, your cash is going to lose ground. So they've got some issues. All these types have issues, but the main thing is that people do tend to fall into some kind of type. The third type is the high roller. This is somebody who just loves the best, the newest deal, the deal that's going to bring them a fortune, and they like the thrill of kind of chasing a high-risk situation. And they love it because they may, you know, hit it big, but they love it because it's exciting. And it's the next thing to gambling, and often it very much is gambling. And the difficulty here is that the high roller cannot pull back from this behavior, because every time something goes wrong, they don't say, oh, what a mistake, I never should have done that. They say, gee, I almost made it. Next time, maybe I'll really make it. So it just encourages them to keep going. And opposite the high roller is the amasser, somebody who loves to see money grow. So they'll be good spenders, they won't get out of control, but they'll love to put it into investments, and every month, you know, watch things go up. They hope, but that's where their satisfaction is. The next type is what I endearingly call the money monk, which the example of the teacher is. This is somebody who has a lot of sense of morality about money and has a feeling that there's something bad about it. It's dirty lucre. You just don't want to deal with it because it's not morally right. So these are people who end up going into fields where they don't have to deal with it, like pure scientists, except of course they have to get grants. Hopefully they can export that job. But anyway, there's a moral issue, not a fear issue here. And then there's a large group of people that just want to avoid money. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to deal with it. There is anxiety and fear, but there's enough so they just push it out of their mind. And those are the people that really get in trouble because they don't open their mail. They tend to turn their backs, and every time they think about doing it, they get a shock of anxiety. So, you know, why would they want to open their mail? That's the way they feel. So these types pretty much settle in late adolescence, and they follow pretty much through adulthood. And one of the things about them is that if they get too rigid and set, then people can't get out of them and be more flexible and find other ways of behaving so that they're always spending or always amassing or always high rolling. And you can see anything that gets that rigid tends not to work very well. And I want to tell you a story, and then we'll shift to the conversation, about somebody who grew up in a house of scarcity. And this is a good example of how, if some of these feelings from childhood stay with people a long time, they really can wreak havoc in somebody's life. And he made a vow to himself, because he did grow up so poor, that he'd never be poor, and he'd work very hard to get as rich as he could. So he did just that, and he was an entrepreneur, and he made this terrific business. So as the business became more and more successful, he got more and more anxious. And his wife thought he was getting anxious because, you know, of all the work of something really successful. No, he was getting anxious because all of the memories of growing up poor started coming up to him and essentially wouldn't release him. And he began to feel, I can't really get out of this. This is the way I grew up. This is the way I'm set. So he started to not pay attention to his business, and the business collapsed. And part of him was devastated, but the other part of him was relieved, because it matched those early memories of what he experienced. And fortunately, he did get into therapy, and the therapy was able to turn him around. So the next time he built a business, he was able to sustain it and stay with it. But my point is that that's how powerful some of these early messages are if they're not really worked with and resolved in some way. Okay, so I have just a very simple process called ABC for getting yourself kind of tuned up to think about talking and having conversations about it. The A is awareness, to try to be as aware as you can of what your feelings and thoughts are about money. So that the most important thing to me would be to be as upfront as you can. So for instance, if you came from a house that had a lot of tension about money, you know, as your kids get older, I wouldn't do this to a 7-year-old, but as they get older, you know, talk about your own experiences with money. There's nothing wrong with that. Kids love it when you share your own experience, unless you do it in lecture format. That won't work very well. And the second is balancing. You know, if you feel that you're a super spender, you don't want to convey that message to your kids. So you try to think, well, how can I balance myself better? I mean, just running through the types that I presented, is there a way that you can incorporate some behavior of the other types to just have a more balanced attitude yourself? And there's nothing that children like better than seeing their parents work on their own feelings and their own behavior. Because, you know, it's like, oh, I don't have to look up to this giant of a person that I'm going to have to emulate one day. It's like, oh, they struggle too. They're sharing their struggle with us, and that makes them more human and more real, and it makes the conversation flow a lot better. And the third of the ABC is to simply communicate. You know, start talking about it. One way, obviously there's huge differences in the age of a child. If you have small children or grandchildren, you know, 4, 5, 6, and 7, one of the ways you can do it is setting up, kids are very concrete at that age, so a lot of talking doesn't do much good. A lot of playing games and, you know, doing things where they can see and feel things are much better. So if you set up 4 piggy banks, one for spending, one for saving, one for investing, and one for giving, and if you give them an allowance so they can have something to work with and kind of make it a teachable moment that you're helping them distribute the money in the 4 banks, that teaches them a great lesson. If you look through the day and how often money comes up, and just take note of that and use those moments as, you know, with an older child, 7 or 8, oh, I heard you talking to your friend about the fact that he has a cell phone and you don't. You know, let's sit down and talk about that. You know, rather than, because what often happens is that the child comes up and says, oh, I want this. And you're immediately saying, oh, wait a minute. So it doesn't get off to a good start. But if you're the one that's bringing this up and you've thought about it, then you can bring it up with a greater balance, which again is my point, to be very balanced about it. And certainly with adolescents, talking about money, talking about the importance of earning their own money, so they can have their own money to manage. Very often I hear parents now saying, Martha, your job is to go to school. Don't worry about getting a job. You know, you can do that when you're after college. And that's great in one sense, but in another sense it isn't, and I'm going to quote 2 studies about that. There's an adult researcher named George Balin who wrote a book called Adaptation to Life, and he's written several others. But he did the original grant study at Harvard that studied Harvard sophomores, I think, and followed them all the way up through, now they're in their 70s and 80s. And he found that the only variation, he expanded this study into not just very privileged people, but blue-collar people and others, and what he found was the only variable that correlated with adult success, and it didn't matter what kind of a family you came from, what kind of a culture you came from, the only factor that correlated was somebody's ability to find industry. So those children who, in my day, had a paper route, or was set up a lawn service, or was really good at the computer, those kids starting, as early as 5 and 6 to have little projects, those were the kids that really did best. And that I think that's one study that really, really impressed me. The other study was done by Doug Heath at Haverford, done a while ago, but he also discovered that the students that he studied, the ones that did the best were not the ones that got all A's. The ones that did the best were the ones that joined a club, worked on a newspaper, worked with other people creating a product. And that was the important variable that made them successful, that they learned to work with other people and that they created something. So I say that very, very strongly because I think that it's very, very important in my mind that children get jobs around the house, have an allowance, get a job as a high school student, and it doesn't, 5 hours a week, something where they develop a sense of what psychology calls self-efficacy, which means that they have a sense of power and confidence about themselves that tell them that they are strong, they are independent, they are capable. And very, very often, if kids, particularly in the House of Power, are given too much, they don't get the opportunity to develop that. And I think that in a very highly competitive culture such as ours, that message gets lost, and kids don't have that sense of they have tremendous sense of expectation, but they don't necessarily have that internal sense of confidence and power. And I don't think there's anything that gives it to them more than being able to have a little domain of their own that works well and gives them something as concrete as money. So with all of that said, I'd love to hear from you about your issues in trying to talk to your kids about money.
In listening to you, this is very awesome.